This is a different kind of video for me in terms of those who are familiar with the videos I'm making these days. So I'm a counsellor with a background in philosophy. These days I'm focusing a lot on my work with men and on a kind of counselling approach blended with coaching. But I've spent a lot of years in a field known as existential therapy, which is a kind of blending of philosophy and psychotherapy. And during that time, while I worked a lot, both in counselling organisations, but also in private practice, and out of all that work, I would write a lot. I'd reflect a lot, obviously, and then write a lot on issues that were being brought to counselling from a philosophical perspective. And one of the pieces I wrote about was OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, I've since taken this off my blog, and I've done a lot of changing, a lot of stuff I've pulled off, and this is because I've been doing this for over a decade now, and I've really come to try and emphasise that I'm not, or I don't want to be, a mental health worker. I work with people's strengths. I work with people's I work with the forward momentum, people trying to sort of, realise their potential in different important aspects of their life, and hence more of a counselling approach. I'm not, and especially I don't want to be a mental health worker, but like a lot of counsellors, and particularly, I've ended up in roles where I've dealt with those kinds of clinical issues, and so for a long time earlier on, I was sort of speaking more to them in my writing, before I really got clear on who I wanted to be over the decade and moved away. So this is a piece that actually, I'm reading this from an email because I was emailed earlier today about this piece that I wrote on existential therapy for obsessive compulsive disorder. I thought, well, it's sitting here in an email doing nothing, so why don't I just make a video where I essentially read out the transcript of this blog post, because I'm probably not going to put the blog post up in written form. So people have often talked about how helpful this is, so I thought, oh, yeah, okay, I'll share it. I'll make a video for those who, for whom this is helpful. So I'm just going to read out the transcript of this blog piece I wrote. And if you have OCD or somebody you care about has it, then I hope this is helpful to you. So this is working from an existential therapeutic perspective, which is to say it's a philosophical approach to philosophy, and hence, a philosophical approach to counselling, and hence a philosophical approach to a counselling perspective on OCD. Sort of a philosophical counselling perspective on OCD. Okay, so I'll just read verbatim. In my work, I am concerned with the use that can be made of suffering alongside the attempt to diminish it. Today, I specifically discuss the use a person can make of their mental illness. I focus on obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. I have supported people in this way while they also undertook specialist psychological treatment for the disorder. Now, there is a fellow I see who has severe OCD, and I've supported and referred him to psychologists, and I do the work around courage in his life, which is a life that involves struggling with OCD. Whereas the psychologist and the psychiatrist, they do work around medications and cognitive behavioural treatments. One of them is a specialist in that field for OCD. So great, they do all that clinical work. I'm working with the human being who struggles and despairs around this thing in his life, whereas they provide a treatment for that thing. Okay, continuing on. If a person cannot change a hateful truth, a hateful reality, then what else might they do insofar as they can do something? They might simply distract themselves from it, or they might engage in the fantasy of controlling it. OCD performs these functions of avoidance, distraction, and fantasized control. In a discussion of death anxiety, existential therapist Irvin Yalom writes that this avoidant and controlling function, quote, writes about this avoidant and controlling function, quote, research reports that over 70% of patients with a severe obsessional neurosis, or OCD, had at the onset of illness a security-disturbing death experience. As the syndrome develops, patients are increasingly concerned about controlling the world and preventing the unexpected or accidental. Patients shun disorder or uncleanliness and develop rituals to ward off evil and danger. Erwin Strauss notes that the obsessional patient's disgust at decay, illness, germs and dirt was intimately related to fear of personal annihilation. I suggest reading Irvin Yalom. He doesn't specifically talk about OCD in a lot of his work. He speaks more generally about death anxiety, but he's marvellous. One of the greatest existential therapists and really worth reading. And the theme of it over OCD will pop up here and there in his work, but his work more broadly is probably helpful for anybody with OCD. Many people who suffer OCD, I continue the paragraph, fail to recognise that they are anxious, or that there is a connection between 1, their anxiety, and 2, its existential roots such as the fear of death, and 3, their OCD. So their anxiety, their fear of death, and their OCD. They fail to see those connections. All they can see are the OCD symptoms which baffle them. So OCD is avoidance. It is magical thinking. It is an attempt to control the uncontrollable. As Yalom suggests, it functions, at least in part, as a set of rituals to ward off danger and the associated anxiety. From the outside, it is easy to assume that people with OCD are irrational compared to the rest of us, but that's untrue. People with OCD vary in intelligence and sanity to the same degree as the rest of the population. Indeed, a part of what pains many OCD sufferers is their sense of the irrationality of their compulsions and obsessions. They know this is crazy, and that pains them as well. They do not reflectively believe that they are warding off danger. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, but often they don't. If they really reflect and sit back, philosophically they don't believe they actually are. Many people don't. Rather, they experience the OCD as an overwhelming compulsion linked to this irrational fear, to what they consider an irrational fear. This is why OCD can feel so humiliating for the sufferers. But here's the thing. Everybody has a tendency for magical thinking, regardless of how rational and scientific they otherwise are. Once upon a time, when faced with life's dangers, we would make a magic potion, perhaps a combination of 3 herbs, to ward off threats. Our brains are very slow to evolve, and this magical urge has not gone away. The potions which people concoct these days use different herbs. Instead of rosemary, sage and thyme, people will mix together a spouse, a career, a mortgage, or they mix together cynicism, detachment and criticism, or some other concoction. The magical ingredients may be fine things in themselves or not. Neoliberalism is a striking example of the latter. If I'm a hard worker, then I will do well, I will be safe, and in order to believe this, I will also believe that people who have not done well must be lazy or bad. Or to take a left-wing version of that kind of right-wing thing, if I do what is considered compassionate, then I will be valued and treated well in life. We all engage in magical thinking, each in our own way. Because many people's favoured potions are socially approved, consider the mortgage example above. I'm not saying mortgages are bad or working hard or creating security is bad. I'm saying those done as a magical potion to ward off danger. I own this house and I know I could lose it. I can't ward that off by some sort of magic. I can only work hard and trust in luck and fate and chance. We all engage in magical thinking in our own way. Because many people's favoured potions are socially approved, consider the mortgage example above, therefore neither they nor others notice their magical thinking, because it's socially approved. OCD, on the other hand, gets noticed. It stands out and is disapproved of, therefore it is seen as a problem requiring pathological explanation, even while socially lauded forms of magical thinking are praised. I'm building a picture of OCD as a particular example of a universal problem. The universal problem is that we all suffer anxiety, which occurs in the face of our human vulnerability, and we all find ways of avoiding it and warding it off. With respect to particular ways of achieving this universal tendency, different people engage in particular non-universal strategies. For example, some people give over to conventionality. Some people become bitter, some people greedy, some depressed, some obsessive compulsive. Every person has an arsenal of particular strategies which differ from their neighbours' methods, so they're particular to them, for engaging in the universal act of avoiding anxiety. I will unpack this some more. I noted that Yalom suggests that OCD functions, at least in part, as a set of rituals to ward off the danger which evokes anxiety. There are three elements here: the obsessions or compulsions, the OCD, the danger, and the anxiety. The existential picture of OCD which I have painted is structured around these three elements, and if we set them out in order, we can say that each is a response to the one below it. I made an image of this which I posted on the blog, and I'll try and post it up here. So hopefully that's appearing on your screen, unless I couldn't make it happen. So number one, so as I say again, if we set each of these three out in order, we can see that each is a response to the one below it. So, number one, OCD is an avoidance or control of. Number two, anxiety. And the anxiety is a response to, number three, the vulnerability or danger of the human condition, the danger of being alive. Through avoidance and magical thinking, OCD is an attempt to be ignorant of and to control the anxiety we experience in response to the danger we face as human beings in the form of the vulnerability of the human condition. That's a bit of a mouthful for some. So through OCD, it's an attempt to control or be ignorant of our anxiety. So it's an attempt to control our anxiety, and that anxiety is in response to the danger of being alive. From the existential viewpoint that I am setting out, this is how OCD arises in a person. To picture the three steps another way, if we were to peel an onion, so to speak, the structure of OCD might look like that image that I just said I would show. By the way, I haven't read this in a long time. I'm reading it. I'm going to surprise myself as I'm reading about what I said. That usually happens with old pieces of writing. But I thought I'd just jump in. There are various psychological ways of responding therapeutically to OCD. The most common approach takes a medical, cognitive behavioural, and often neuroscientific approach. This is captured in Jeffrey Schwartz's book, Brain Lock. There are also psychodynamic or psychoanalytic approaches, and Nancy McWilliams' Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, that's another book, exemplifies this. While a more detailed discussion can be found in H.P. Laughlin's 1967 book, The Neuroses. That book might seem hard to find, but I got it on abe.com, abe.com. Fascinating book, actually. The essence of existential therapeutic support for OCD is that we need to come to terms with life. The challenge is to face reality and accept it. And by acceptance, I mean ultimately that we need to learn to love life. To love this life with full emotional recognition of the painful truths from which we instinctively withdraw. And I can't remember if I say it further on below, but of course the painful truths we also have experienced. So there's a trauma in being alive. One thing I'll say about this, I'm stepping out of role for a moment, one thing I'll say about this reflection, as I've continued to sort of learn more, reflect more over time, I really have to emphasise the neurological roots of OCD. I think from memory I talk about this below. I had OCD when I was young. I didn't have it severely like I've since seen in other people. And I worked through it by various means until the point where it's just a ghost in the background for me. It's not a thing, and it tries to flare up and I just refuse to let it be a part of. I don't react, because if I do, it'll start to write its way into my brain again. It'll write its way into the pathways of my brain. But I really would emphasise, I guess you could say that the cause of OCD is probably different in different people. And some people it's definitely very much hardwired into their brain. In terms of the Jeffrey Schwartz's Brain Lock, it's I think some people are born with an OCD brain, and that'll vary as well. I think I was probably born with maybe a tendency toward that, but there's trauma running through the family. And I think trauma does get encoded at the level of the cells, at the level of the genes, all these kinds of things. It's very physical in the body. I think it gets passed down generations, not only in terms of nurture, but also in terms of nature. I think that's probably the case. But I think some people are very unfortunate to just have brains that are on high alert. They're on OCD alert. Okay, so I'm talking about this from the philosophical level about how we can respond to OCD with courage and so on. And that's really important, and maybe that's 25% of the picture for you, and 25% is massive. Maybe that's a massive part of the picture for you in terms of how you live with the fact you have OCD, even if it doesn't change the OCD. Maybe for some people it's 75% of the story. For me it was. Okay, so look, there's lots of variation here. I don't want you to whip yourself because you're trying to insist to yourself that this is all just a rational problem and you can solve it rationally, if that's not the case. Okay, for some people medication might be absolutely necessary. For some people it's absolutely unnecessary among people who have OCD. So it's not just one thing. Continuing on. Okay, so I've just summarised a few ways of understanding it, and then given this kind of philosophical perspective that it's about a challenge to courage. Because what's the opposite of anxiety? It's courage. Readers who are waiting for something more clever, a technical intervention, a psychological strategy, might assume that the above is a first step. But as Kierkegaard has said, quote, "Whoever has learnt to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate," unquote. Kierkegaard was a great 19th century existential philosopher. This recognition and acceptance of reality is itself the greatest challenge in life, and its achievement is harder than we realise. Strategies fall by the wayside by comparison with accepting the anxiety of being alive and accepting that courageously. This is not a matter of heroics, but it does require courage. Many who suffer OCD are particularly sensitive to the painful truths of the human condition, so they may need more courage on a day-by-day basis than those who have a talent for blindness. The way forward is demanding, but it is worth it. My concern with the medical model, which reduces OCD to a meaningless mental illness, is that unless we struggle with the valleys and peaks of our inner life, then we become passive. We need to be active, to be agents in our lives. We cannot hand over our recognition of and struggle with the human condition to the technical experts who will treat us. It is an abdication of the self to forego both attention to one's inner life and the need to craft it. To forgo this is to reduce oneself to an object, to being inauthentic in the existential sense, failing to author one's life. It is the land of the mechanical, the functional. In Kierkegaard's words, we have then lost the ultimate. This is why Emmy van Deurzen, the philosopher I quoted earlier, writes that, quote, "Anxiety should be the starting point of therapy, not in order to alleviate it, but rather because anxiety must be considered the starting point of a well-lived life," unquote. Just as OCD, where are we? Time, 18 minutes. Okay, this is a long one. But if you're suffering from OCD, I hope you stick this out. I think suffering's a bit of a motivation, isn't it? Just as OCD is a particular expression of a universal challenge, so too it can be a particular invitation and means for facing the anxiety of the human condition. We need to find a use for OCD rather than simply a cure for it. To use Kierkegaard's wonderful word again, we have realised the ultimate when both pleasure and suffering are secondary to the pursuit of genuinely good living. Of course, this runs counter to our tendency to believe that pleasure equals good and pain equals bad. The pain is something with a negative value only, which must be done away with. If you suffer OCD, then as strange as it sounds, although you suffer, you may be more fortunate than the person who engages in evasion and magical thinking, control, through pleasurable or socially approved means. For in your case, you cannot fly under the radar. You are confronted with your behaviour, confronted with the, quote, starting point of a well-lived life, unquote. Normal forms of evasion and magic do not involve pain, and neither do they attract the sort of criticism which invites change. OCD does. OCD can be a pathway, therefore, for becoming more attentive to life in its depths, including its universal vulnerabilities and the pain that's attached to that. It can become a pathway to being more courageous and loving of life. Just Seeing how far we've got to go here. Not too far. I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to diminish your OCD, but rather you might also take this different attitude, holding on to your desire for a cure. So I'd say pursuing a cure, while also putting your problem to a higher use. Perhaps this approach will make more sense to those who have tried to cure OCD by conventional means and found that it does not go away so easily. Of course, the distinction between a cure and a use fades in reality, or it merges. It's more complex than that in the lived reality. OCD is something that you do, and to use OCD in this way is to do the opposite of OCD, facing the fear rather than avoiding it, courageously loving life with all its danger, despite all its danger. Therefore, this use weakens the obsessions and compulsions at their root. However, to maintain this important distinction, such a cure is not my main point. So what I'm saying there is, using your OCD as a point of being courageous is a way you cure the OCD. And that's been my experience. But what I'm saying in this reflection is that's not the main point. Indeed, such a paradoxical cure only works if you value the use of OCD above the desire to cure it. So you detach from the cure and focus on the use of it. This requires that you accept that you may always have a tendency to OCD as your instinctive strategy for reacting to life's anxieties. So this is old-fashioned language for me, like I wrote years ago coming out of philosophy. The actual sentence is, this requires that one accept that one do this and that, and I'm translating because I don't speak that way anymore. This requires that you accept that you may always have this tendency to OCD, that it may always be your instinctive strategy when it comes to life's anxieties. This does not mean you cannot largely overcome it. And here I say, how do I know? Because I grew up with OCD and I took this approach. Nobody would have guessed that OCD sits in the back of my mind like a subtle kind of white noise. For I no longer act on the compulsions. I face them in the way I've described. And this is true. I have OCD as a background noise quite regularly. If you've been a counselling client of mine, I've probably been sitting there with OCD going on as an urge. But it's background noise, just like the traffic outside of our office is background noise to me. This is because I won't play into it. I won't act on the urge, and so it just weakens and weakens and weakens. So I am suggesting something more daring than an alternative cure for OCD. I am saying that we ought to consider consenting to the existence of our OCD and doing so in each moment as a consent to, or perhaps a kind of clarity about, the thing that OCD is avoiding, the danger, the anxiety. So it's an acceptance of that fact and a lucidity, a facing of that fact. What OCD avoids is no less than our humanity. It's no less than the human condition that we're trying to avoid through OCD. To consent to that reality is a work of wisdom and love. It's a work of wisdom and courage, love of life. Last paragraph here. I have set out a proposal to treat OCD as a means. On reflection, not unlike those spiritual exercises which the ancient Stoic philosophers and the medieval monks engaged in. To grow in lucidity, in order to grow in lucidity regarding reality, in this case our human condition. To grow in your capacity to bear well the anxiety which courageous living arouses. And to hone a capacity to love life. Okay, so that's it. Look, it's a kind of existential, you could also say it's a kind of Stoic approach to OCD. It can be translated into different spiritualities as well. It's really about, on the one hand, look, and I'd make this more clear these days than I used to in the past, because I see these things as much more bodily and chemical than I maybe did in the past. Go seek a cure for your OCD and seek it through mainstream means, and that might involve medication. That definitely either way would involve something like cognitive behavioural therapy and exposure therapy done by a specialist in this field, who's worked with OCD a lot and understands it well. But also recognise that you might cure it, or on the other hand, you might cure it through this more existential approach, or if that doesn't cure it, you might live better with it and sort of become wiser and more courageous about life as a whole. So don't waste your suffering. Do this as well. Do all these things. They're not they're not in contradiction. They don't have to be in contradiction with one another. People try to set them up as in contradiction. I don't think they have to be at all. You are a chemical being. You are a cognitive behavioral set of stimuli and your neurological pathways and etc. You are a conscious, intentional, philosophical being as well. You are all these things and you can do all these things. I invite any comments, any discussion around this. Absolutely. Look, I'm not the guru of truth. I get things wrong. I'm just, this is a perspective that I gave articulation to quite a number of years back. I don't know, maybe 8 years ago or 7 years ago. I've become less intellectual in my way of approaching things over time, certainly, but I think this could be helpful to people. Certainly, I've always got good comments on this. As I say, I've removed it from my main focus, from my website, because this kind of clinical psychological stuff is not what I want to put across as stuff that I work with. And I'm really removing myself from that whole mental health sort of thing. But nonetheless, I put this out there because I hope it's helpful to some people. Okay, thank you for listening.